As of September 2009, the city now contains 99 charter schools. They serve less than 5% of public school students, more than 32,000 children, mostly in the elementary grades. Mayor Michael Bloomberg and his school's chancellor, Joel Klein, envisioned doubling the number of charters in the city to 200 schools. Gotham Gazette. Mayor Bloomberg's initiative to reform the public school system in New York City has led to the creation of nearly 100 charter schools. Any New Yorker who watches the news or reads the papers knows that the city's public school system isn't in the best of shape. But what do we really know about the city's public school system? For that matter, what do we know about these charter schools that are popping up all over the city?
Do you know what charter schools are?
Not a clue.
Not a clue? What are the main difference between charter and public schools?
Charter is not public, and public is public.
How do charter schools get their funding?
By chartering boats.
Do you know what charter schools are?
No.
Do you know how they're funded?
No.
Do you know the difference between a charter school and a public school?
No.
Charter schools, like public schools, are institutions that receive public funding as well as private donations and are part of the public educational system. So what makes them different from public schools? Charter schools can be established by non-government entities like universities with specific educational goals that they feel cannot be accomplished by local public schools. These parties draw up a charter stating how they plan to reach these goals and present their plan to the school chancellor and the Board of Education. When a charter is approved, certain restrictions and regulations that apply to the public schools are lifted from charter schools' obligations.
The creation of so many charters in New York City was intended to offset and eventually counteract the trend of schools that are failing, according to state and nationwide testing standards. But how effective are charter schools? Do they benefit the city students, or are they doing more harm than good?
Charter schools started to appear in greater numbers with Mayor Bloomberg's proposals for school reform. The school reform fever caused by President Bush's No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 brought with it a symptom that the city has yet to shake: standardized testing. Today, the argument that constant tests are working has been the basis of current Secretary of Education Arne Duncan's school reform initiatives. New York City's participation in national and statewide standardized testing showed the comparatively low performance of several public schools in the city. One of Bloomberg's proposed solutions for the failing school system has been to create more charter schools, which are expected to perform at higher standards and act as an example for public schools. But do charter schools actually perform better?
According to several critics, there has been no notable progress. Debates have suggested that New York State has dumbed down its tests. In the 2009 National Assessment of Educational Progress, there has been no progress in 4th and 8th grade math since 2007, and only moderate progress since 2003. But in reality, in 2008, New York students were still at the bottom 10th of the school district statewide in language arts and at the bottom 5th for the 4th grade and 8th grade math. The stats suggest that Mayor Bloomberg and school chancellor Joel Klein were exaggerating and misrepresenting the improvement to the general public.
For the last few years, the city's schools chancellor, Joel Klein, has been threatening to close schools that show consistently poor scores on standardized tests, and several of these schools are soon replaced by charter schools. Just last month, the city nearly shut the doors of no fewer than 19 failing schools in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. What do these schools all have in common? Most of them are located in neighborhoods that have large minority and immigrant populations.
The community and the United Federation of Teachers is out rallying to prevent the schools from shutting down. Teachers union says the closures would have the greatest impact on high-needs children from low-income households.
The proposal to shut these schools down was met with a storm of protests from angry parents, teachers, and students in the neighborhoods surrounding the schools. Bloomberg's plan was going to squeeze out institutions that serve the city's neediest students and replace them with charters. The next step is figuring out where the students from closing schools will go. The charter schools that replace them are not necessarily required to take them in. They are not, after all, zone schools.
Charter schools are generally far smaller than the average public school, and when an overflow of students sign up for admission, spots are determined by a lottery, at which hundreds are often turned away. So where do the rest of these students go?
Because it's not guaranteed that the kids, once they bring this charter school in, that the kids that are already in the school will be able to go into that charter school. I think it's fair to the children. I don't think it's fair to the community. I don't think it's fair to the parents.
Usually, students in failing schools get herded into some other zone school whose resources will not only be overcrowded by the influx of new students, but whose test scores in the future will most likely reflect those of failing schools whose students they inherited. This is not, however, the fault of students or the teachers. It just shows that the shuffling of students in and out of schools is merely a method of evasion, a game of institutional musical chairs that fails to solve the real problem. And the real problem is what is being taught in the classrooms apart from standardized tests.
Although the decision to close these schools was ultimately overturned by the state, the locations of these failing schools cannot be overlooked. The debate that ensued highlighted the racial dimension of public education in New York City, an issue that has been exacerbated by the redirection of resources and funds from public schools to charter schools instead.
Charter schools in New York City receive funding and financial support from the city. According to a study conducted at the University of Michigan, New York City charter schools are legally categorized as local education agencies. As such, they receive funding on a case-by-case basis, and money from federal programs goes directly to the charter schools. The most sensitive of these issues, however, is the issue of physical space for these schools to establish themselves. As is so often the case in the city, finding space to house new schools is very difficult.
In recent years, public schools have been forced to share their buildings with charter schools that do not have their own established spaces. Gail Robinson of the Gotham Gazette reported, as of September 2009, there were approximately 99 charter schools in New York City, and most of them were located within other public schools or inside Department of Education buildings. Mayor Bloomberg had hoped that New York City might have a chance to compete in Race to the Top, a new plan set forth by Secretary of Education Arnaud, which encourages state governments to apply for educational funding.
The new funding initiative seems to be reflective of a trend toward charter school promotion that is becoming more and more popular nationwide. What does this mean for New York? For now, the city does not have a stake in Race to the Top funding because New York State did not make the final cut for competing states with more suitable applicants. According to this nationwide initiative, however, we can be sure, however, that the age of charter schools here in the city is far from over.
Instead of opening up several more charter schools alongside the 100 or so the city already has, perhaps we need to focus more on fixing the public schools themselves, starting with bringing the focus away from testing and back to academic content. Despite the successes of a handful of charter schools in the city, we have very little proof that they perform distinctively better, and we have yet to see markedly rewarding results from them.
In a recent New York Magazine interview, Brandy Weingarten, president of the United Federation of Teachers, stated that these reforms are built on a Jack Welch model of command and control and intimidation and fear, and that's just not the way teachers work.
With the incessant promotion of charter schools and the threat of public school closings hanging over the heads of thousands of city teachers, classroom priorities in both types of schools may not be in any place to improve because the root of the issue, academic content, is not being addressed. Instead, we're witnessing firsthand an evolutionary stage in the city's public education system, whose results, despite the good intentions behind them, may be far more costly than we realize. In the race to create more charter schools, the city might not stop in time to realize that damages like the ones we have already seen might outweigh the gains in the long run.